So, how do you decide which charities you support? Maybe it's because a good friend asked you, or perhaps they're working on a problem where you have a deep personal connection. Or there's a desperate need in the world that just pulls at your heartstrings. You might even ask them what their overhead rate is, or how many people they've reached. But do you ask them the simple question, does it work? Is what they're doing actually fixing the problem? Or are they getting more bang for buck than others who are out there? And do they have a path to scale to the size of the need? We ask these kinds of questions when it comes to investing in a company or buying a product. So why shouldn't we be just as rigorous when it comes to social good? Over the past 30 years, we've made slow but steady progress in expanding access to crucial services like clean water, electricity, and sanitation. At the same time, adoption of mobile phones has skyrocketed. This means that today there's more people who have access to a mobile phone than a toilet. We should be aiming for this kind of impact when it comes to tackling the world's most desperate problems. The good news is that lean approaches can help us drive much greater social impact at much greater scale. The bad news is it's a bit more complicated. In the lean startup, Eric talks about the value hypothesis and the growth hypothesis as the two most important assumptions for entrepreneurs to validate. When it comes to social innovation, we need to add a third, the impact hypothesis. In other words, does it work? In order to maximize social good, we need to deliver on all three of these. And just like in business, if we skip that early validation, we're only going to be wasting precious time and money in the long run. So today, I want to dive into each of these three hypotheses, talk about some of the unique challenges that arise in the social sector, and share some examples of how organizations have tackled them. So let's start with value. One of the things that makes the social sector more complicated is that we have to contend with two completely different categories of customers, our end users and our funders. Now, in business, typically your end user is also the one who purchases your goods or services, so naturally these two are 100% aligned. But when they're not the same, they can have different priorities that pull you in conflicting directions. So let's start by talking about the end users, sometimes in the social sector also known as your beneficiary. Typically, when you're trying to achieve product market fit, you refine your product and you refine your market targeting to find that best fit. But when you're trying to solve a social problem, you can't exactly abandon those most difficult to reach users, because helping them is often your whole point. This means that we have a lot fewer degrees of freedom, and understanding our users is even more important. This can be a challenge in itself, because when we're talking about working with disadvantaged populations, these are people who are often very different than ourselves, whether because of class or culture, or they may even speak a different language or live in a different geography. This means that our instincts can often be misleading. And that even when we get feedback from them, we may misinterpret that feedback. This means that it's even more important for us to deeply understand our users and build trust. When Proximity Design decided to work with smallholder farmers in Myanmar to improve their livelihoods, they picked up and moved to Myanmar. This enabled them to engage communities in each step of their design process for building products like their low-cost treadle pump. It also allowed them to iterate quickly, bringing out prototypes to farmers in the field on sometimes a daily basis. Now, when we don't take the time to truly understand our users, we can make bad assumptions. When PATH offered poor families in Cambodia the choice between a basic water filter and a nicer design that cost twice as much, 15 times more families chose this more expensive model. It turns out that they were embarrassed to have something that looked like a garbage bucket sitting in the middle of their home. Just like you and I, people tend to make decisions based on dignity and aspiration more than, quote unquote, what's good for you. So now let's add into the mix funders who have their own sets of priorities. Traditional grants from foundations or from government are often at odds with lean approaches. To start with, they require a detailed design up front in the form of a grant proposal. This is something I called the enforced waterfall model. Any changes to that initial plan require an excruciating renegotiation process. Not exactly what I'd call agile. On top of that, grants can impose a tight overhead rate, making it difficult to invest in R&D, training your staff, or tools and infrastructure that can improve productivity. Finally, funders often work in narrow silos by sector, by geography, by demographic, or all three. This can unnecessarily constrain finding the best solution for the problem. The upshot is that funders are typically trying to micromanage to minimize risk rather than experiment to maximize learning. At USAID, our US government's foreign aid agency, we pioneered a different model of funding that would better support innovation. It was modeled after venture capital and called DIV, or Development Innovation Ventures. We used a tiered evidence-based model rather than issuing monolithic grants, and started at grants of $100,000, then $1 million, then $5 million. By starting small, we could take more risk and place lots of bets, enabling our entrepreneurs to experiment. Then, based on them getting traction, we could increase our funding and help them scale. Now, let's talk about growth, which is also more challenging in the social sector. So between wanting to help people who are suffering today and funders who pressure us to hit targets, many organizations can focus primarily on reaching as many people as possible in the short term, rather than looking at ways that they can scale in the long term. A typical grant program ramps up quickly to meet pre-committed delivery numbers, something lean startup would call vanity metrics. This can mean scaling too fast before you've validated your underlying solution, making it much harder and more expensive to test and iterate. Of course, with a lean approach, we want to start small and stay small so we can test and improve our solution. Grants and donations can help us get started, but it's extremely rare that in itself, philanthropic funding will get us to the scale of the need. So we also need to validate the drivers that can accelerate growth in the long run. Let me share just a few examples of how the paths that organizations have found to get to scale. Of course, when it's possible, taking a market-driven business model is the easiest and most straightforward way to get to scale. Through 3 rounds of funding through DIV, Off-Grid Electric in Tanzania was able to prove their solution to sell home solar systems using a pay-as-you-go business model through mobile money. Because they were able to find this financially self-sustainable solution, they were able to raise over $100 million in private debt and equity. Scaling your social solution doesn't necessarily mean scaling your organization. For example, microfinance was pioneered by Muhammad Yunus at Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. They wanted to provide small loans to poor people who didn't have access to traditional financial services. Through replication by both nonprofits and for-profits, this model has now spread around the world and reaches over 200 million people. Closer to home, Alcoholics Anonymous got started in Ohio, spread their idea through the publication of a book, and now has over 100,000 chapters worldwide that are self-sufficient. Now, when it comes to core services like health and education, government can often be the most viable path to get to scale. Code for America discovered that in California, a third of eligible recipients were not signed up for the state's SNAP food stamp program. When they dug into it, what they discovered was a cumbersome and convoluted sign-up process with many points of failure along the way. So they created a much simplified website and streamlined the sign-up process and are now starting to bridge that participation gap with the aim of reaching 500,000 people next year, all through existing government funding. Summit Public Schools is trying to disrupt the traditional model of stand and deliver education. They started out by testing, iterating, and refining their own model for self-directed learning through their own network of charter schools, and they saw dramatic results. Based on that, this year, they've trained teachers from across 14 states who are now taking this model back into public schools in their own communities, again, leveraging existing government funding. The third, and ultimately the most important hypothesis, is around impact. This is the core reason for being for the social sector, and yet too often, we don't really know how well our solutions work. One of the reasons is that we tend to fall in love with our solution or intervention, rather than staying laser focused on the problem we're trying to solve. Kinnery had a passion for orangutans and wanted to preserve their habitat in Indonesian Borneo. Now, the traditional path would be to start a conservation nonprofit to protect the forest. But instead, she went to spend time with the communities and did something she called radical listening. What she learned was the primary driver for deforestation was when there was a health crisis, and families would have to raise large sums of money very quickly in order to send their loved one to a far-off and expensive hospital. So Kinnery started Health in Harmony to open health clinics in the local community that were affordable. Today, 85% fewer families are participating in logging as a result of this non-traditional intervention. Now, let's be honest. Measuring social impact is harder and takes longer than measuring something like e-commerce transactions. This can be an excuse for many organizations to put off measuring impact of any sort for years, completely breaking the possibility of any kind of meaningful feedback loop. The good news is that organizations like ID Insight are introducing less expensive and faster tools to evaluate impact. Lightweight proxies can often give us a good indication of how well our solutions are working so that we can improve and refine them before investing in an expensive, rigorous evaluation such as a randomized control trial. For example, it can take a long time to measure whether the incidence of malaria has been reduced in a particular community. But if you find that families aren't even sleeping under the mosquito nets you provided, it's highly unlikely. We need to start bigger. We need to think bigger and start smaller when it comes to social innovation. By validating value, growth, and impact up front, we can improve many, many more lives around the world. If you'd like to learn more, please join us today and tomorrow afternoon across the street at the Village, downstairs at the Lean Impact Space, where we're holding breakout sessions to dive deeper into each of these three topics. Thank you.